Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema. Today I've got a video that's been in the works for a little while, and I've been teasing it on my Instagram a little bit. I am going to be talking about the 10 movies that have scared me the most. I find this a really interesting topic because I think, it's interesting, to talk to other horror fans, and, a movie could maybe work for you in some ways, but maybe it didn't scare you in the way that it was, intended, but for other people, it's the most terrifying thing that they've ever seen, and I just find that phenomenon really interesting. And before I get into it, I just want to say that I'm not saying that these are the objectively scariest movies ever made or anything like that. Film is completely subjective. I'm just saying that these are the movies that have scared me the most. So at number 10, I'm already kind of cheating here because I have two movies in the number 10 spot. Basically, every time I, took one off the list, I was like, that doesn't feel right. And then I would replace it with the other one, and I'm like, that also doesn't feel right. So my tie is between The Evil Dead, the original, and Skinamarink. So starting off with The Evil Dead, I think that this is an interesting movie because I think it's one that when people think of certainly the franchise, but even to some extent the first movie, they tend to think about comedy. In some ways, the first movie even is just kind of like I think somebody described it before as like the Three Stooges, but with gore. And then of course, Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness kind of like go even further with the comedy aspects. But I think people forget how serious the tone of the first movie is and how straight it's played at the very least. Yeah, it's absurd, it's over the top, it's all these things, but it is definitely played completely straight in that first film. There's a lot of really great scares in it, from the demon POV shots to the demon, the old hag in the basement, basically, to my favorite, which is actually the card scene. The scene where the woman is reciting what the cards are and she's getting it all right, and she suddenly, and you realize through the music and just through the tone of the scene that something's really wrong here. And the way that transitions into full-on like possession horror, just something about that really, really gets to me. Kind of gives me the feeling of a nightmare in the way that not many movies do. And then Skinamarink, which is the movie that I have it tied with, call me crazy. I know a lot of people don't like this movie, and it's also just kind of bold to put such a recent film on an all-time list like this, but Skinamarink really did scare me that much. And it's not just that the film is these sort of dark, creepy spaces, occasionally interrupted by these loud screeches, but it's the first of these kind of like creepypasta, found footage-esque movies that actually, to me, has real horror atmosphere. You're not just scared of the jump scares, but you're scared of the dark spaces, the digital grain, all these sort of unknown things on the screen. And the film convinces you that even when it shows you something a little bit brighter than those dark spaces, that's not comforting either. It really does take me back to, when I was a kid, just kind of sitting alone in my house in a very dark room and just kind of like, just being paranoid by that whole by the just being surrounded by unknown spaces. So yeah, I don't know. I get that a lot of people don't like it. I get that it's really slow and experimental, but it really worked for me. At number 9, I have a movie that is not only much more accessible than something like Skinamarink, but is something that I would say is very underrated, and that is Angel Heart, directed by Alan Parker. And I know that not everybody that has seen Angel Heart is going to agree with me on this, but one image that really scares me in the film is an image towards the end involving a couple pairs of yellow eyes. And a lot of people might look at that image and say it's corny, it's a little bit over the top, it doesn't really scare them, but something about the way it transitions from normal to those yellow eyes really freaked me out when I first saw it. But I think everyone who's seen the film can probably agree that it has a really, really strong atmosphere of dread. It's a detective noir film about a guy investigating the disappearance of a guy called Johnny Favorite. But the further he gets into this case, he realizes that there's really a dark turn at every corner, and that this is all going to end very badly. And to me, the ending is really, really scary because, once we get that final shot of sort of the elevator descending, I won't say what it's descending to, but you realize just how inevitable what we've been watching has really been the whole time. And there's something about that inevitability that I just find really terrifying. Number 8 is The Witch, directed by Robert Eggers. I'm probably going to use this word a lot in this video, but The Witch really has some of the most effective atmosphere I've ever seen in a horror movie. I think for one, the fact that there's so much like attention to detail in all of the sort of period detail of like the 1600s and all that. From the dialogue to the sets to just the way the characters interact, I think that really paints a picture that what you're watching is actually happening to real people, even though it's not. And there's something about that definitely, about that realism that definitely gets to me. But it's not just that, it's also the very like moody score and the kind of moldy looking cinematography that really just kind of creeps into your mind while you're watching it and or unnerves you. And what I like about it too is that it's a movie that doesn't really follow horror conventions in terms of like jump scares or loud screeches or anything like that, but it's also not one of those like A24 slow burn movies that doesn't actually build to anything. Very early on, we're shown that yes, there is a witch in this forest, and you know, that's not really a spoiler, it's just sort of like Hitchcockian tension. And it really just ratchets up that tension dial for this family. And there's also just a lot of really creepy images that kind of stick with me. So like, you know, for me, the image of Black Phillip sort of rearing up on his hind legs, I've certainly seen that in my dreams before after watching this, or certainly that exorcism scene, or the attempted exorcism scene, I should say. Yeah, that's some pretty terrifying stuff. Speaking of exorcism, my number 7 is The Exorcist 3. So don't get me wrong, I really, really love William Friedkin's original Exorcist film. I think it's basically a masterpiece. I just love how, you know, it's just such an intimate story about coming to terms with your own faith in the face of such dark circumstances. But it just doesn't scare me that much in the way that everybody seems to talk about it. And I can't really put my finger on why, but whatever it was that was missing for me in the original Exorcist film, just in terms of the horror of it, Exorcist 3 really, really capitalizes on. For one, there's nothing in the original Exorcist film that just scared the shit out of me anywhere near as much as that jump scare. And I won't tell you where in the film it is because I want you to be affected by it in the same way that I was. But it was like a night terror. Like I just could not believe like what was happening in front of me. And looking at it in retrospect, I'm shocked that the film was directed by a guy who's primarily a novelist, William Peter Blatty, and not somebody who is like a, you know, horror filmmaker at the top of their game, because it's just one of the most intelligent, well-paced jump scares in the history of movies. But also I think, you know, comparing this one to the first movie, I think the first film has moments where the horror is just a little bit too like turned up to 11 for me. The whole like, you know, your mother sucks cocks in hell, like that sort of, you know, everything that the demon is speaking through Reagan in the film. It's really cool, and I think it does work for the movie. It just doesn't really work for me in terms of the horror. But Exorcist 3 I find to be much more like understated and more focused on just like building tension. Brad Dourif is brilliant in the film. He plays the Gemini killer, and I think that this is really one of the most scary, like unnerving performances I've ever seen from somebody playing like a serial killer type person. In a lot of ways, Exorcist 3 is kind of a precursor to films like Seven. And again, I'm not saying that Exorcist 3 is better than the original Exorcist. I do think that The Exorcist, the original, is just, again, it's just such a sad movie. It really affects me in that way, and it's just so beautifully put together that, you know, I guess as just a film, I would say it's better than Exorcist 3. But Exorcist 3 scares me so much more that I had to include it on the list. At number 6, I have a movie that a lot of people, you know, definitely know about in the horror community, but I still think is really underrated in general, and that's The Descent, directed by Neil Marshall. And this is one where definitely if you're looking for a movie to put you in a state of just sheer panic and claustrophobia, you've got to check this out. If you don't know, it's about a group of women who go exploring caves, and they get sort of trapped down there, but while they're trapped, they realize that there's something down there that is much scarier than just the sheer claustrophobia of being stuck in a cave. But the claustrophobia certainly is part of why this is really, you know, panic-inducing. If you are claustrophobic, this has so many sequences where people are just like squeezing through really tight tunnels, and the camera is placed so where you really understand how claustrophobic it is for that character. It's definitely gonna be a hard one to watch if that's something that really gets to you. But once the other survival danger really reveals itself, it just it feels like you're trapped in the cave with them. Like it is just one of the most terrifying, like unnerving things I've ever seen. I will say that if you watch it, please make sure that you get it with the British ending. It's a British film originally, and the British ending is fantastic. It really kind of sends home why everything is so scary. The American ending is just kind of abrupt and stupid, to be honest. And now I'm getting into the top 5, and we're kind of getting into like all-timer horror territory for me. All 5 of these movies I would consider like some of my favorite horror films ever. So my number 5 is The Thing by John Carpenter. So I knew I had to put a John Carpenter movie on here because he's one of my favorite directors, and he's kind of most known for horror, and he has so many fantastic horror movies. And I was really wrestling between this one and Prince of Darkness to put on the list. But even though Prince of Darkness I do find to be a little bit more experimental and like unconventional in its horror, I do find myself a little bit more affected by the cosmic horror of the Thing. I reviewed it on my channel back in October, I think, so definitely check that video out if you're curious as to my thoughts. I won't go too in depth with it here. But I just think that for me, it's the pinnacle of cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is really difficult because it's about translating the fear of the unknown and putting that on the screen. So how do you do that? How do you translate something that we can't even imagine to the screen? And for me, in The Thing, it's really the textures of those practical effects that are able to do that. It just looks like nothing you've ever seen in your life when you see those effects, and it does look completely alien, like something we could, like a human could never come up with, but yet Rob Bottin's brilliant special effects did. And so in that way, you really buy into the illusion. It also, I really like the sort of cold nature of when the computer explains how fucked we kind of are as a human race in terms of like if something like The Thing were to come to Earth, and how like, sort of exposed we are. So the film definitely has those horror layers, those practical effects, and the cold nature of it, which bring out that cosmic horror. But I also find that it's just a really, really great movie about characters, sort of trapped in an enclosed space and dealing with paranoia amongst each other. And at a certain point in the movie, that really does become the heart of the film, even though that there's still more like crazy effects and stuff to be found throughout it. So yeah, The Thing's just fantastic, and yeah, had to put it on the list. Number 4 is a movie that I watched within the last few months, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I watched it back in January, and I had to watch it again later in the week because that's how much it was stuck in my mind. And that movie is Cure, directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. But even considering how much it stuck with me in that time, it is a really, really difficult film to discuss, especially about why it's scary, just because of how dense it is. For one, Kiyoshi Kurosawa's style is really understated compared to a lot of his horror filmmaking contemporaries. He likes to shoot horrific scenes in very wide frames and not really have a lot of music to sort of emphasize the horror. Often it'll just be more like ambient sounds instead. And to me, because he's not using those filmmaking devices, but he's still showing you horrific things, it becomes a little bit creepier to me. It's almost like he's showing you how horrific the mundane world is. And again, those ambient sounds really give the film a horror atmosphere that sort of builds tension. But it's really the content of the story, the more I watch the film, that really gets under my skin. It's about a series of killings that are done in the exact same method, but are otherwise completely unrelated. And the killers always say when they're caught that they were just suddenly compelled to kill. They'll say things like, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And the detective who's solving this case has to get into the headspace of this suspect they have, a guy named Mamaya, who they have gathered is hypnotizing people to commit these murders. But similarly to other non-horror movies kind of in this detective genre, the further that this detective gets into this case, the more he realizes that he's just driving himself into insanity. But on second viewing, those ideas that the film has about the nature of your true self that you suppress with your conscious mind really came into light in a horrific way. It's like the film is saying with its title that you can cure your itch to meet your true self. But if you do that, you have to go to the darkest realm of your psyche. And if you do that, how could you ever recover? So I won't spoil too much of what happens to by the end of the film or anything, but it's very satisfying, and God, that last image especially really, really sticks with me. Number 2 and 3, we have a couple of all-time classics here. Number 3, I'm gonna put The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick. One day I'm gonna review The Shining in full for sure, but it's definitely, it's a film that resonates with me in a pretty unique way. Unlike a lot of people, I actually really love the changes that Stanley Kubrick made from the Stephen King novel. I think that by making Jack less sympathetic from the beginning, the film accomplishes 2 things. One, the film just becomes more horrifying because we're worried about Danny and Wendy from the start of the film. And also the horror just becomes a lot more realistic because it's less about the sort of corny, haunted house story and more just about how the family are bringing all this horror into their situation. And I think that's just very relatable for the audience, those sort of family dynamics. The inevitability of this psychopath's worst tendencies just bubbling to the surface, it just so perfectly captures like a vulnerably real aspect of human behavior. We've all seen what it looks like when a person just totally loses it and becomes unstable. And to me, it is the exact same feeling that you get watching The Shining. And it is very over the top, as people, people have criticized The Shining for being kind of kabuki theater. But I think that that's what makes it realistic, because when somebody really gets unstable like that, it's almost comical. And of course I have to mention the ending, which not only just creeps me out like witless, but just also keeps me thinking about the film and plants it into my brain for just weeks after I watch it. So yeah, I love The Shining. I don't know how many times I've seen it, but it's definitely an all-timer for me. Number 2, another all-time classic would definitely have to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper. There's not too much I can say about this that hasn't already been said. I just think it's, it just captures sheer terror in a way that almost no movie in history ever has. When you're watching it, it really just feels like it could be a snuff film or some disgusting thing that you shouldn't be watching. And it's violent, of course, but it's not so much that the violence is emphasized visually so much as it is that you can feel the violence. And it's the gruesomely serious tone and how artfully, carried out everything is that just makes it feel just so evil. And I also think it's a brilliant film in terms of its commentary. I think it's kind of tapping into the way that Americans especially perceived violence at that period of time. But beyond its historical significance, I mean, I just watched it about a month or so ago, and it was as terrifying as I've ever seen it be. Just the way that last shot, of Leatherface twirling the chainsaw in the air, and then it just cuts to black, like just leaves you with that finality of that violence. It's like splinters in my mind. And number 1, the scariest movie I've ever seen is George Slizer's The Vanishing. Talking about the original Dutch film, not the shitty Jeff Bridges American film. I had heard a lot about this movie's reputation when I rented it from the video store, and I was still shocked by how much it actually freaked me out. Some people will debate whether this is even a horror movie. I think it definitely is, but it's a more unconventional one than you might think. Similarly to Cure, a lot of why this film is really scary comes down to what it has to say about the nature of the self and the nature of evil specifically, and how both films kind of argue that really anyone can be like as evil as possible. All it really takes is impulse. But beyond that, I think that The Vanishing is an absolute masterclass in exploiting what I think everyone deep down really fears the most, and that's losing control. It's a movie I'm not gonna spoil, but it really lures the audience into obsessing over the disappearance of this character Saskia as much as her former partner Rex. And we care so much about scratching this itch to find her that we really give up all of our trust in the filmmaker, George Slizer, just as much as Rex ends up giving his trust to Raymond, who we later find out he's admitting to abducting Saskia. And the ending of this film is probably the most traumatic, horrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. And it's just made so much worse when you think about it in retrospect, because it's like, when you watch it, your thought is, of course, this had to be where it was going the whole time. But even though we as the audience at some level knew that this was going to end really, really badly, even though we probably didn't know how badly, we still stayed. We watched this happen. We watched this play out because we wanted to know just as much as Rex wanted to know. So yeah, in that way, I think it's really, really horrifying. I think the guy who wrote this needs help. That's how much it scared me. But anyway, that's gonna do it for the video. Thank you guys so much for watching this, especially if you watch the whole thing. Please like this video down below and subscribe to the channel if you want. And also comment, what are the movies that have scared you the most? Again, I really love just hearing from other people about this topic. I remember when the movie Smile came out, and a lot of people told me that for them, just that image of her smiling in that creepy way was just one of the scariest things that they'd ever seen. And I didn't really feel that at all. I didn't really understand it, but that's what I mean, is just I just love how sort of subjective this all is. So even if you disagree with me, it's like, that's totally okay. I'm just really curious what scares other people. So yeah, so definitely let me know in the comments. I should have some more reviews out soon. I'm not really sure what I'm gonna be reviewing next. I also have a John Carpenter rank in the works, so definitely stay tuned for that and other reviews, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.